Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Matt Friedman. I'm the CEO of the Mekong Club, and today we are going to be having a great presentation entitled Modern Slavery Statement Preparation Tool. And what we're going to do is to try to give you some insights into how to better standardize some of the things related to how statements can be made. But before I hand it over to another Matthew Coghlan, I'm just going to say a few words about my own experience related to this. Back around 2010, we were hearing stories about how in California they were going to have some type of an act that was going to address modern slavery. And then 2 years later, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act came to be. As most people know, that particular act pretty much just says if you're a big company, $100 million, and you have in profits in either retail or manufacturing, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. You're not doing anything at all. You say that you're in compliance, but you have to say something. This type of legislation was called transparency legislation simply because it was meant to allow consumers to see what was going on. A couple of years later, the UK Modern Slavery Act came out. It basically was more comprehensive. It reduced the level from 100 million US to 36 million pounds, but it added two additional things. Number one, you had to have an annual report, and number two, it had to be signed by the board of directors. Then the Australian Modern Slavery Act came in 2018. All of them have very similar types of motives, but different types of approaches that are required for them. So the Mekong Club, on a regular basis with our association members, reviews the submissions that people have for these various acts. And it allows companies to just get some feedback from us. Did we cover what we should have? Are there things that you suggest? We don't do the submission, but we will review them. And as a part of this process, over time, we had kind of what I would describe as a checklist that we would use. But it was simply a listing of different characteristics that we thought were relevant and important. But over time, what we were hearing more and more and more from the organizations we were working from was, wouldn't it be great if we had a standardized piece that would take all of the various suggestions and the guidelines and to make it very easy and simple for companies to kind of go through this process and to use it as a checklist as well. So we basically looked around and found Matthew Coghlan, who is the person who's going to be presenting today. We talked to him about this and agreed that he was going to help us with this standardization. And so what he's going to be talking about is this tool that he's developed based on his years of experience. It looks at kind of the specifics of what the legislation says. So much for my phone being off. Sorry about that. Some examples of organizations that are doing the right things, and it includes some checklists. So I think that you will find the talk very interesting. The paper that he produced is amazing. And with that, I'm just going to introduce Matthew. He is an experienced international development and human rights practitioner. He holds an LLB from the University of Melbourne and an MA from the Australian National University. Matthew worked on social justice and democratic governance issues in Southeast Asia for 15 years, from 2004 to 2019, including migrant workers' rights, indigenous peoples' rights, the rule of law, and access to justice. He was a senior management person from Deloitte, Australia, in its sustainability practice, providing governance, policy, and risk advice to the Australian government and private sector clients on compliance with Australia's Modern Slavery Act and state human rights laws. With this, I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for your participation. Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction, Matt, and welcome everyone to the webinar. what we plan to do today to introduce the tool is to run through the objectives, the methodology, and the structure of the tool. And then, as Matt mentioned, I'm going to share some experiences from my advisory time assisting Australian clients to implement the Australian Modern Slavery Act, to provide some flavour to a modern slavery preparation tool. So, introducing the tool to begin with, as Matt has mentioned, what we were seeking to do is to provide a standardised approach for businesses that might need to comply with either the UK Modern Slavery Act or the Australian Modern Slavery Act, or both of these acts, with a tool that they could pick up and use reasonably easily to understand the requirements of those acts and to start to think about how they might prepare for and draft their own modern slavery statements. But we also thought it would be useful to incorporate existing critiques of modern slavery statements, particularly those that have been submitted under the UK Modern Slavery Act and critiques that have been produced by UK Modern Slavery. And then finally, it has drawn on the experience that I've had advising Australian clients, so that what we've done is to bring together a package which can be used as a common guidance for both laws, but which also needs to be nuanced according to the different legal frameworks and approaches. And as we'll see in a little while when we go into the detail about the two UK and Australian acts, they are different in some respects. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the methodology that we took was to start by identifying what the requirements are of each of the two acts that we were looking at. And then we reviewed different sets of guidance or analysis. Both the UK government and the Australian government have produced fairly lengthy guidance in relation to compliance with their acts. And so we went through that guidance fairly carefully. In addition to, as I mentioned, looking at different UK NGOs' analysis over the course of time, particularly relating to the UK Modern Slavery Act. And in the UK, there's two major groups that have been critiquing UK modern slavery statements, and they are the Core Coalition and the Business Human Rights Resource Centre. And on an annual basis or biannual, they've produced some very good analysis of where they think the strengths and weaknesses lie in the way that UK companies in particular have been planning and implementing the UK Modern Slavery Act and preparing and submitting and publishing their modern slavery statements. We also integrated modern slavery advice into the content and preparation sections of both the UK voluntary areas and the Australian mandatory criteria. And this allowed us to produce some short checklists. If you have a chance to look at the tool, the checklists follow each of the different short sections on the content that might go into a statement. And then at the end of the document, we've set out the checklists together. So for businesses that are looking to very rapidly understand what might go into a modern slavery statement, they can look directly at the checklist. And then finally, what we thought would be useful would be to benchmark the different law, guidance and analysis against existing UK practice. And we had a look at different leading statements and came to the conclusion that UK retail companies and UK global banks often produce some of the most detailed and ambitious modern slavery statements. And so we drew on 6 of them to provide some case studies in the tool itself. Next slide, please. So the structure of the tool, based on both those objectives and the methodology, is initially we've set out international legal standards and national legal requirements. The international legal standards largely cover the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And if you want to learn more about that, you can have a look at the tool itself. I won't be going into much detail about that today. and also the national legal requirements. So we'll go into a little bit of detail in a moment about both the UK and the Australian acts. We also extracted some of the overarching principles based on the legislation as well as the government guidance in particular, which we thought would be useful to consider when preparing statements. The tool has a longer list of principles, and as we'll see on a subsequent slide, we have pulled out some of the key principles to mention today. Then I'll explain which are the different voluntary areas and mandatory criteria that we think are important to address, and the tool itself will provide more detail on both the standards in relation to those criteria or areas, as well as specific content that you might consider. And then, as I mentioned, the tool goes into best practice, and you can see there's a list of the 6 different high street retailers and global banks from the UK that we surveyed in order to provide some lengthy case studies to accompany the different criteria and areas. Next slide, please. So turning now to the acts themselves, and just to talk through a bit of the detail, Matt has already addressed this in part. So the UK Modern Slavery Act applies to commercial organisations that supply goods and services with a turnover of not less than £36 million. And those organisations must prepare a slavery and human trafficking statement. That statement must be approved and signed by the board and signed by a director of a body corporate, other than a limited liability partnership. And then in the UK, under its law, the compliant organisation has to publish the statement on its website, including a link in a prominent place on its homepage. And then if it doesn't have a website, it needs to provide a hard copy on request. In the UK, as I mentioned, it provides voluntary areas, whereas, as we'll see, the Australian Modern Slavery Act provides mandatory criteria to follow in preparing modern slavery statements. But the content of those areas and criteria are relatively similar. So in the UK, the legislation suggests that the organisation structure, business and supply chain should be included, policies in relation to slavery, due diligence processes, risk assessment, effectiveness, and then staff training. Next slide, please. So the Australian Modern Slavery Act is a bit different. In one sense, it's broader, and in another sense, it's narrower. It's broader because it covers Australian entities and entities carrying on business in Australia. So unlike the UK Act, it's not limited to commercial organisations that are supplying goods or services. And that means that it covers non-profit organisations. In addition, and although it's not mentioned on this slide, the Australian Modern Slavery Act also applies to the Commonwealth Government, which is the central government here in Australia, as well as Commonwealth corporate bodies. And the Australian government has recently published its first modern slavery statement and uploaded it onto the dedicated website, which has been set up for Australian modern slavery statements. But the Australian Act, the scope of the Australian Act is narrower than the UK Act because the monetary threshold is Australian $100 million, which means it's aimed at larger companies than the UK Act. And they need to submit modern slavery statements to the Australian government within 6 months of the end of their reporting periods. And the definition of the reporting period is the accounting period that an entity uses. So in the case of most Australian entities, that will be the Australian financial year, which runs from July to June every year. But in the case of other companies, they might be operating on a calendar year, for example. And then, like the UK Act, the Australian modern slavery statements need to be approved by the principal governing body, which in the case of a company is usually the board, and signed by a responsible member, which in the case of a company will be the director. As I mentioned, the criteria that reporting entities under the Australian Act need to include are mandatory. And so that places special emphasis here in Australia on understanding those criteria in detail and then thinking about how they can be implemented. And the criteria that are identified are identifying the reporting entity, describing the structure and operations and supply chain, doing a risk assessment of operations and supply chain, describing the actions that are taken, including due diligence and remediation processes, describing how the reporting entity assesses the effectiveness of those actions, describing the process of consultation, and then there's a 7th criteria, which is any other information. So if you have a look at the flow of the 7 criteria under the Australian Act, you can see that a lot of thought has gone into how a business should go about assessing and addressing modern slavery. So the Australian Act's mandatory criteria move through setting out or describing what the structure of the business is, in particular in relation to its operations and supply chain, what risks exist in those operations and supply chain, and then what actions have been taken on the basis of those risk assessments, again covering operations and supply chain. And then finally thinking about how do you assess the effectiveness of the actions that have been taken in response to those risks. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's a number of principles which underpin these 2 pieces of law. And most obviously of which is that both of them are transparency in supply chain laws, and their object is to encourage large businesses to understand modern slavery risks in their operations and supply chain better, and then take action to prevent or mitigate or remediate those risks, and in the case of remediation, actual cases of modern slavery. Each of these acts thinks about risk in terms of the risk to the victim or risk to people as opposed to the risk to business. And this is a major shift in the way that businesses often think about risk. And my observation working with Australian clients is that initially when a client begins to look at the Modern Slavery Act and to start to comply with it, it's often still thinking about business risk. And so new tools and new approaches will need to be developed, and new awareness and understanding increased, so that businesses which are complying with the Australian Modern Slavery Act start to think more in terms of what does risk to the victim or risk to people mean in the case of the different types of modern slavery. And then the actions that might need to be taken don't necessarily need to establish new frameworks, controls, policies, or procedures. They can build on what a business already has put in place, and often that's the most effective way to introduce modern slavery risk assessment and action into a business operations and supply chain, and then to report on that. And so a good example of that is starting to think about how do you incorporate modern slavery risk into a general business risk framework, which might consist of a risk register, a risk appetite statement, treatment plans, and so on. And the clients that I've worked with often haven't been up to that stage yet, but the more ambitious are thinking about how do they get to that stage. Their initial approach to compliance with the Australian Modern Slavery Act is to do standalone risk assessments of modern slavery, and then to start to develop standalone actions in response to that. But I think what we'll see in the next reporting period, or the one following that, is much greater integration of modern slavery risk into the way that businesses are doing their business. And then finally, both of these acts expect continuous improvement, and that's underpinned by having an annual reporting requirement, but it's also supported by the practice that I've seen, which involves very often brainstorming actions that can be taken and sequencing those actions so that they can be done initially for the first modern slavery report where that's possible, but then preparing a roadmap of future actions that can be taken to ensure that continuous improvement is built into compliance with the law. Next slide, please. So the tool starts to, as I mentioned, the tool synthesizes a variety of different sources to provide business with guidance as to how it can go about preparing a modern slavery statement reasonably quickly and efficiently. While neither act prescribes the structure of a modern slavery statement nor the content needed to prepare the statement, one of the key approaches that we've seen in Australia, and it's likely the case in the UK as well, is that the criteria provide a structure at least for the first modern slavery statement. And so I went through the criteria previously, but if you have a chance to look at the tool, you'll see that we've followed that approach as well. And I've set out the structure here. So we've added a couple of extra pieces to it, including an introductory section which you provide some guidance as to how you might start off introducing your modern slavery statement. There's some information about preparing a roadmap, which I just discussed. And then it goes into the same types of voluntary areas or mandatory criteria that exist under the UK and Australian Act. I'm not going to go into further detail about these standards and that content. I encourage you to have a look at the tool. And obviously, if you have any questions for us about the tool and about the content preparation, please don't hesitate to ask us those questions. Next slide, please. And then finally, as I mentioned, as we've gone through synthesizing the different sources of the law, the guidance, the analysis, and so on, we've been able to pull out some key questions which then constitute a checklist for businesses to go through very quickly to ensure that they're complying with the most obvious requirements of the law, and they're thinking about the most commonly used content or the most commonly expected content to meet those criteria and areas. And so the example that we've provided here relates to a checklist for structure, operations, and supply chain. And so asking questions about, have you explained your legal organization? Have you described your business operations? And have you shared a mapping of your supply chain? And then some short questions about doing the risk assessment as well. So have you identified modern slavery risk in your operations? Have you set out a risk assessment for your supply chain? And it indicates different indicators that could be used to do that, such as country and industry risk. Have you started to prioritize your higher risks and explain them? And then have you thought about, and this is a point that I made earlier, have you thought about how you might integrate modern slavery risk assessment into existing risk frameworks? So next slide, please. So that completes the introduction to the tool. Hopefully we'll receive some questions and comments about it in the Q&A following this next section, and we look forward to responding to them. This next section is just continuing to share my experiences and insights advising a range of different Australian companies and government entities. The companies that I've advised are located in key Australian industries such as extractives and utilities, retail, wholesale, insurance, and superannuation sectors. And in terms of the government clients, they've been both at federal and local government level. I've also provided advice both on modern slavery and human rights, and the two things are in a sense linked, because the human rights advice very often draws on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, or the state-based laws here in Australia require similar types of actions to modern slavery laws, such as putting in place policies and procedures and remediation mechanisms to deal with human rights complaints. The clients that I've worked with have all been at different stages of their modern slavery and human rights journey. I found that a majority of them were seeking assistance with basic compliance so that they could at least have content to complete their first modern slavery statement, but perhaps that also indicated a compliance-driven approach, at least initially, to thinking about implementing Modern Slavery Act requirements. But I have worked with some leading companies that were beginning advanced preparation and thinking about, you know, some of the more ambitious types of actions they could take based on risk assessments which they'd already conducted. And so for the companies or clients that were, you know, interested in basic compliance, what that generally looked like was conducting operations and supply chain risk assessment, and then taking some preliminary steps to act upon that. And an even more basic approach that I saw was to just look at supply chain risk rather than operations risk. And I think that was an interesting approach, because the Australian Modern Slavery Act clearly calls out the need to look at operations risk as well. And you know, I'll be interested to see whether those clients do follow up to look more closely at operations risk in follow-up reports. So operations risk assessment generally involved understanding the coverage of and weaknesses in things like governance, controls, policies and procedures, and also looking to see whether that particular business or its industry had been involved in any modern slavery cases themselves. The sorts of governance actions that might be taken for basic compliance include setting up a cross-functional modern slavery working group. The sorts of controls, as I mentioned, relate to conducting that basic risk assessment, and then perhaps thinking about doing supplier screening. Policies relate to both human resources and to procurement. Human resources, because a lot of modern slavery risk comes through recruitment practices, and procurement in relation to setting up supplier codes of conduct and contract provisions that suppliers then have to comply with. And supply chain risk assessments often involved mapping supply chains to begin with. And the typical technique that we used was to obtain accounts payable of all suppliers within the 12-month period or within the reporting period, and then to assess them against geographic and sector or product risk indicators. And this provided clients with a baseline of where their risks might be, but and it used online tools to conduct that type of risk assessment. But I think, you know, a major weakness in this approach is it doesn't provide specificity to businesses regarding what their particular risks are. And so I think the next stage for businesses that are doing this sort of baseline supply chain risk assessment is then to look at that and think about how can they learn more about the nature of risk within their supply chains, and what are the types of actions that they could take in response to that. And then advanced preparation, often, you know, as I mentioned, it depended on client progress and maturity and ambition and leadership, and it could include things like training for the board in relation to its supervisory functions, training for senior management in relation to their decision-making roles, dedicated training to procurement teams and HR teams, and then general awareness raising for staff. I've already touched on policy and contract review, but obviously there's more to that than just the things I mentioned. So, you know, a fuller approach to modern slavery in HR might touch on recruitment practices, but then go into other policy areas like non-discrimination and diversity and inclusion. And in relation to procurement, that might be broadened out to look at beyond a supplier code of conduct, to look at overall procurement policies and procedures, as well as changing contract provisions. And then risk controls I've touched upon, so I won't go into that in too great detail again. And then supplier engagement. So one of the things that we noticed was that leading companies are often well advanced in terms of their supplier engagement. Usually they're doing this through a questionnaire approach to understand whether at least their first tier of suppliers need to comply with modern slavery law, have put in place you know, different actions to respond to modern slavery, such as policies and procedures and contract provisions. And then to use them as the basis for having follow-up conversations with suppliers that are either weaker in terms of their response, or they fall into a higher risk bucket, such as suppliers that might be based in higher risk geographic locations. And then finally, leading clients are often already thinking about what industry collaboration they can set up or belong to. And then, as I mentioned, they usually think about and include a fairly detailed roadmap for that continuous improvement. And so all of this then feeds into drafting first modern slavery statements. And I think, as more statements are uploaded to the Australian government website, we'll be able to see which companies are at the beginning of their journey and which companies are quite advanced. Next slide, please. And so now what I thought I would do is just to run through some, specific examples of advice that I've given in the past to Australian clients, just to provide some flavour to the tool and those general comments about experience and insights. So the first one relates to a professional services firm, which had a very complex procurement system. Its procurement system was divided up into Australian procurement and global procurement, and those two things overlapped. It was divided up into procurement of different types of products and services, and there were different procurement teams for them. And it was also divided up into monetary thresholds for higher purchases being procurement team and lower purchases being general staff. And the board had taken a strong interest in modern slavery compliance for this firm, and it was briefed on the Act and what was needed in order to comply in the first instance. And the project that I was involved in involved a cross-functional project group which consisted of procurement people, legal people, risk people, and sustainability people. And so the assistance that we gave in this case was to firstly spend a lot of time mapping out the procurement process so that we could identify who were the suppliers within that, and then to work out what could we conduct a risk assessment of. And in the first instance, we couldn't risk assess the whole of the supply chain due to lack of information and different stages of contracting processes. So what we endeavoured to do was to run a risk assessment of the majority of suppliers that we could at the time we were doing that. And so for this firm, there is the need to continue that process of fully risk assessing its supply chain. Then we assisted it to develop a simple risk management framework based on that complex procurement mapping. And that consisted of a number of different stages: the supplier risk assessment, which built in the supply chain risk assessment and other steps; a decision-making process, which was based on risk; different types of contract monitoring, which was also based on risk levels; and then a combined remediation mechanism and incident response plan. As part of policy and contract monitoring, we assisted the firm to update its supplier code of conduct, which are called a responsible business policy, and then to update key contracts. But because of the complexity of the procurement system and contracting lying in different parts of the firm, we only updated a small set of contracts. And so another thing that this firm will need to do in the future is to broaden out those updated contract provisions relating to modern slavery risk management to the rest of the standard contracts that it's using. And then finally, we developed an online training module, which consisted of a core module which ran through the features of modern slavery, such as statistics, indicators, and impacts, and so on. And then we developed specific sub-modules for different parts of the firm. A dedicated module for procurement, which drew on that risk management framework that we had developed. a dedicated module for teams like legal and risk, which picked up on the policy and contract updates, and then a sub-module for client-facing staff that were providing services to increase their awareness about modern slavery, and to also start to engage with clients about modern slavery as well. Next slide, please. And so then the final example is a superannuation fund here in Australia, and I can see that time is elapsing, so I'll wrap this up fairly quickly so that we have 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So in this case, the superannuation fund didn't need to comply with the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, but it was being asked by its clients that were providing it with money to invest on their behalf, what it was doing to strengthen its approach to modern slavery risk management. At the same time, it was also building out its approach to ESG, and given the advent of the Australian Modern Slavery Act, it was clear that modern slavery was a key component in the social factor within ESG. It used a manager of managers approach, which meant that it had external fund managers that were investing on behalf of the superannuation fund in a whole variety of different assets located globally. And so we conducted a supply chain risk assessment of both the fund managers themselves as well as the investment portfolio. And I guess this is the key point, that the investment portfolio was risk assessment was a very complex process. What we needed to do first was to understand what assets were being invested in, and then to decide which of those assets could we actually run a risk assessment on. And then we needed to decide what indicators would we use in order to run that risk assessment. And those investee companies were described in multiple ways in terms of the industries and sub-industries that they exist in, as well as multiple ways in terms of geographic references. So they could be described in terms of where they were legally registered, or where they were listed on a stock exchange, or where their headquarters were, or where their operations were. And so we had to develop a methodology for approaching that. And the key principle that we applied was to try to use the sources of information which were as proximate to where modern slavery cases might take place as possible, such as the location of a headquarters in the case of employees, or the location of operations, in the case of developing countries, in particular, for example, for a mining company which might have operations in developing countries. And then we also supplemented that with a risk, with a supplier questionnaire for the funds managers, which allowed us to understand what their level of understanding of the modern slavery legislation was, and what actions that they'd taken in response to that. And one of the big conclusions out of that is that it was a very mixed bag. The funds managers that were focused on ethical type investments were very well aware of these pieces of legislation, but others that were investing in different types of assets weren't necessarily across it. And then finally, just to wrap up, we assisted in developing a standalone modern slavery statement, and upgrading an external grievance mechanism, and then providing training to different parts of the organisation. So that brings my presentation to a close, and I believe we're now moving on to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Really appreciate an excellent presentation there. Just a reminder to everybody on the line, you are able to submit any questions to us either via the questions box or the chat box on the GoToWebinar control panel. We've had quite a few questions come in already. We will try to address them all now. If we are unable to address any questions, we will make sure that we follow up with you guys after the webinar. So Matt, first question, we've had this a couple times. Is it necessary to produce a separate statement for the UK and Australia, or is it possible to produce just one statement to cover all of the legislation?
Well, I think it's possible to produce one statement because the areas and criteria that they use do overlap quite significantly. although the order and the emphasis that they place on those areas is different. But you also need to ensure that you're complying with the letter of the law in both jurisdictions. So I'd caution you to make sure that before you submit a statement which goes to both countries, you check the law and make sure it complies with both.
Great, thank you. So Roger asks a good question around the differences between framing your statement with a view to the risk to the victim as opposed to the risk to the operation and supply chains. He asks, in some business entities, it's quite hard to understand the risk to the victim, or the victims are largely hidden. So how would you suggest businesses go about doing this effectively?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think this area is a work in progress. And you know, my answer certainly isn't the last word on it. The way that the Australian government has approached that is to refer to the UN Guiding Principles and the way that it defines risk. And so it defines risk in terms of three concepts: causing, contributing, and directly linked to. And so the idea is that if you think about your operations and your supply chain, and you work out, is there anything in them which causes modern slavery, then that's a possible indication that there is a clear risk to the victim, or there might be victims of modern slavery. And so a good example of that that's been given is knowingly running a business which involves modern slavery. In terms of contribution, that's a step removed from cause, and the examples that have been given in relation to that in the Australian government guidance touch upon business models which require just-in-time delivery, and that then increases pressure on supply chains to produce, and that then might lead to cases of modern slavery in order to produce goods quickly or cheaply. And then directly linked to is a more amorphous concept, and it really goes to a whole supply chain. And so a good example of that is the electronics industry, where risk assessment might take place in relation to IT suppliers, either in Australia or the UK, and then down one level in Malaysia and China. But directly linked to within that whole supply chain takes you back to raw material extraction processes. And one of the paradigm examples of modern slavery that's used relates to cobalt extraction in Central Africa. So to sum that up, I think this is an emerging area, and the UN Guiding Principles provide a method for starting to unpack what risk to the victim looks like, and businesses that need to comply with these acts should think about, can they apply that methodology, and then where does it take them? But having said that, in my experience, looking at the different indicators that are commonly provided in relation to geography or industry or entity, it is often the case that risk to the victim does overlap with risk to a business.
Great, thank you. Good answer. So in terms of risk assessment processes, and in terms of your experience in working with companies in Australia, we understand that many companies have very, very vast, quite complex supply chains. How far down the supply chain do companies tend to go? And have you experienced any companies kind of successfully going beyond that tier one immediate supplier level?
So in the case of the Australian law, the answer is that there's no prescription as to how far down you should go. But there is a mandatory criteria that you should assess risk, and there is this principle of continuous improvement. So taken together, that suggests that over the course of time, a business should understand the risk in its supply chains more deeply, back to the point of extraction or agriculture. Sorry, Phoebe, can you just repeat the second part of that question?
Yeah, so the question was kind of related to whether you've seen any companies that have successfully gone beyond that initial tier, and kind of how they've gone about that.
Yeah. So in the case of the companies that I've worked with, they've generally used an accounts payable approach to assessing risk, which has two advantages of allowing them to understand their full supply chain at the top tier level, and also what the baseline looks like in terms of risk for that top tier. But the disadvantage has been that that approach doesn't go below the top tier, and very often for Australian companies, their first tier are other Australian companies. And so if you're using indicators of risk such as geography, in this case Australia, or industry, which exist in Australia, usually the risk has come out low to moderate depending on the industry. So businesses will need to think about how do they develop methodologies to go further down the supply chain. And obviously audits and inspections have been used in the past, but the Modern Slavery Act and the guidance that accompanies it has really thrown open the methodology that can be used to understand risk further down the supply chain. And as I mentioned, a typical approach that's being used in Australia in the first year of reporting is to send supplier questionnaires to understand whether there's legal obligations to report, whether any actions have been taken in relation to operations risk or supply chain risk. But beyond that, for Australian companies at least, I think the methodology needs to be developed. And so suggestions that are made in the guidance relate to establishing strong relationships with that first tier of suppliers so that you can work with them to understand what the risk looks like below them. Introducing contract provisions in procurement processes. So those contract provisions provide the basis for further fact finding. And then perhaps adopting collaborative approaches to this. So, one of the things that's interested me moving from working in the policy setting in Southeast Asia to advising clients in relation to the Australian Modern Slavery Act is that NGOs and donors have done a very good job of mapping particular sectors and industries such as the electronics industry or the palm oil sector. But once you have a look at the scope of a business's supply chain, you realize a lot more work is needed to understand risk within them. And so I think a good way to start thinking about that is collaborative relationships either within industries to get a better understanding of risk down the supply chain, or working with stakeholders such as NGOs and donors that are on the ground and can provide those sorts of insights.
Great, thank you. So Mike kind of addresses the issue around reviewing of slavery statements, right? So companies publish these statements, they go on their websites, they go into the central repository. But is there any kind of body out there that's currently carrying out independent reviews on the content of those statements to verify whether what is being said is current and accurate rather than aspirational?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of penalties under the Australian Act, the government can name and shame if it doesn't think a modern slavery statement is up to scratch. And then it has other powers to assist in that process. So that suggests that the Australian government is looking at the statements before it's uploading them to the Australian Modern Slavery Registry. But it's not necessarily publishing its thoughts about the standards and the quality of those statements. It's just assessing whether they meet a certain standard for publication. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there are NGOs and academics as well in the UK that have done a really great job of analysing modern slavery statements and indicating what the benchmarks and standards for them should be. I anticipate that we'll see, similar analysis taking place here in Australia, and there has been some preliminary top-line stuff coming out, but not to the same detail, on a year-by-year basis that NGOs in the UK have committed to.
Great, thank you. And is there any guidance that's been put out related to how to incorporate the impact of COVID-19 into these statements?
Yeah, so the Australian government put out a guidance on that, and you can find it on the Australian Border Force website, together with the guidance that I've been referring to. It's been a while since I've read it, but the basic thrust of the guidance is COVID is having an impact on supply chains and operations, obviously. When drafting modern slavery statements, reporting entities in Australia should call out those impacts so that it's clear when others are reading those statements that they have impacted on their ability to conduct risk assessment or take actions and so on. The other thing the Australian government did was to extend the reporting period for Australian entities reporting under the Australian financial year to the end of March this year. So I think we can see a lot more statements being uploaded from April onwards.
Great, thank you. Just to remind everybody, we've just got a couple more minutes for questions, and we will try to address them all before the end of the session. So yes, the slides and a recording will be sent out after this session to everybody who's registered. Okay, so Matthew, what is your view, if any, on the use of supplier disclosure type platforms? So these kind of services whereby you can get risk ratings from a third-party service provider for suppliers. Do you see that as a positive thing to engage with as part of this process?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, you know, I've used a tool like that to conduct the baseline risk assessment based on accounts payable. And I think that was useful in getting a snapshot of where risk lies in relation to particular countries and industries. But I don't think that tool could be used to do supplier screening because it's not specific enough. But what I also noted about that tool is, and other tools like it, is that they're reliant on other data sources, and you know, there's only so many data sources out there at the moment. So what we need are more media reports, more NGO reports, more other analysis of modern slavery to feed into those tools so that they're even more effective. And very often the results that they give can be quite generic based on country and based on industry. So for instance, if you're running a super fund which has a fund manager in a developing country which is regarded as high risk, then that will produce a high risk result, but it doesn't necessarily tell you whether that fund manager and its investee companies are really subject to that modern slavery risk. And so further investigation would be required to understand that. So a good example of that is, you know, very often modern slavery risk is associated with migration. And if you're running a business which is, you know, a white collar business based in an office investing in companies, then you may not be so exposed to that. So the overall risk rating for the country might be high based on that indicator of high migration, but for that company in the way that it does its business and the industry it belongs to, it may not reflect what its true risk is.
Great, thank you so much, Matthew, for some excellent answers to those questions, and thank you everyone on the line for such great questions. There's a couple more that are actually more kind of addressed to Mekong Club. So just first off, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining this webinar, and as a couple of the questions have asked how we can actually access this tool. So as you may be aware, the tool outlined today is part of a suite of tools and resources that are available to Mekong Club members of our business association. So if your company is a member of the Mekong Club, and I know there's a lot of members on the line today, then you can log in and access this tool right now on the toolkits page of our website. If you're a member and you need help logging in, you need your password, feel free to get in touch. Kat will bring up the email address on the screen in a second, and we can send you your password and everything. If you're not a member of the Mekong Club and you want to find out more about how to get involved, we're very much actively looking for new companies to join our business association, so please get in touch to find out more about our work. We work with a wide range of private sector organisations to develop the tools and resources that they need to ensure a comprehensive anti-slavery strategy like the tool that you've seen today. We have legal legislation guides all the way through to e-learnings, online trainings, risk assessment, remediation tools, and many more. And we also work with companies to review their modern slavery statements. So once you've used the tool and if you're looking for feedback and inputs, you're welcome to reach out to us for some confidential advice and guidance. And we also assist in helping companies assess where they really are in terms of their anti-slavery strategies and help them to roadmap for the future. So thank you again, everybody, for joining. Please feel free to visit our website, drop us an email at info@themekongclub.org to learn more. And once again, thank you so much, Matthew, for such an excellent presentation and for all of your help in putting this tool together. And thank you to everybody on the line for joining this session. Please do stay in touch.